Hi everyone, my name is AJ Shank. I'm a Visitor Experience Associate with the History Center, and I am so excited to be here today with my friend Andrew. Andrew has a really exciting job. He works at an aquarium. Andrew, do you want to tell me a little bit about your job?
Sure. So I'm the director here at Glen Echo Park Aquarium. We're a small aquarium just outside of Washington, D.C., and our mission is to teach about the Chesapeake Bay. So all our animals inside this room here live either in the bay or they live in rivers that flow to the bay, like the streams and rivers near you guys over in Pennsylvania.
That is so cool. Well, Andrew is here to talk to us about one of my favorite creatures, the eastern oyster, because Andrew's aquarium has a very special type of, well, aquarium. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. So our aquariums here focus on the local environment, the Chesapeake Bay, and one of the keystone animals of the Chesapeake Bay is a two-shelled animal called an oyster. It's a cousin to the clam, it's a cousin to the scallop and the mussel, and in a long way, it's kind of a cousin to the octopus and squid. So let's change our camera around and show you some oysters inside this small aquarium right here. Now, this is just a display aquarium for today's purpose. It shows some oysters that were collected yesterday down by Virginia Beach at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. It shows some empty oyster shells that are years and years old and don't have any live oysters attached anymore. It also shows some animals that live with oysters, such as these barnacles, sponge, and seaweed. And over here in the corner, we've got two oysters, one that's not alive and one that is alive. Now you'll notice the living one is closed up and the empty one, well, it actually looks like it's open. If I reach in there and pull these shells a little bit, we'll see that there's nothing inside there, right? So that's an empty, dead oyster. All the meat is gone. Here at Glen Echo Park Aquarium, we also have some permanent exhibits that show oyster reefs. Let me show you those over here on our brackish water side. These three aquariums have various oysters at different ages, and most of these are glued together to look like an oyster reef. This is our most popular oyster reef. It has three little hills inside, and you'll see that these oysters all stick out with their very, very sharp shells. That protects them, and the fact that they're glued together, naturally they glue themselves to each other. That means that when a storm comes, they won't wash up on the beach. So this is an oyster reef tank, and this tank has lots of different animals inside of it. Besides the oysters, there are fishes that oftentimes are found near these oyster reefs. Fishes like these guys towards the top, known as mummy chogs. The little fish down here, known as a blenny, and some other small fishes known as gobies. So oyster reefs are amazing places.
Wow, it sounds like oyster reefs are really important to the Chesapeake Bay.
Absolutely.
Why do so many animals like to live around them?
Well, oysters, because they're stuck together, they form these little nooks and crannies, like little caves, and the surface of the oyster acts as a great place for other animals to live on. So these barnacles have chosen to glue themselves to these shells. Once they're stuck, they'll never, ever leave that spot. You can see they're actively feeding right now. The nooks and crannies are great little caves for small fishes and crabs, such as the mud crab. Now, of course, the mud crabs need to feed, and by living with the oysters, all they have to do is walk around and find barnacles to crush and eat, or baby oysters to crush and eat. So it's kind of like an underwater rainforest. It's very, very active, lots of different animals living together and sometimes feeding upon each other.
That is incredible. I never thought of that, there being such a thing as like an underwater rainforest.
So oysters also do a very, very important job for the Chesapeake Bay. They filter the water. One oyster, such as an oyster this size, just 3 or 4 inches long, can drink 50 50 gallons of water in a day. Now, I don't know about you, but
Wow.
I could never drink that much water. But for an oyster, that's how they feed. They're just constantly breathing the water in, filtering out small particles, and eating the plankton. Now, if there's other small particles such as mud or silt, they'll filter that out and poop out little dirt balls. So in the process of eating the plankton, they're also cleaning the water and making it much clearer. So that's very, very important for our Chesapeake Bay.
That's incredible. So they're like super cleaners. It sounds like
Absolutely.
it sounds like it's really important for their water to be clean around them too, right?
It
So that
is. So when we have a big rainstorm, the rain will sometimes pick up dirt from the ground and turn it into mud, putting that into the streams and creeks that flow into the Susquehanna or some of the other rivers that go in the bay. And that makes the bay really muddy, and that can make it difficult for the oysters to breathe, but they'll filter that out pretty quickly. And that's super important because if the water gets cleared quickly, then we have sunlight reaching down to our underwater plants, our grasses. The grasses, sometimes called submerged aquatic vegetation, is super important for habitat, and it creates oxygen for these fishes. So there's a big, big relationship between oysters, grasses, and other animals in the Chesapeake Bay.
that's so interesting. It's like they're all connected. I imagine
Absolutely.
if oysters ever went away, if for some reason we didn't have them in the bay anymore, that would be a disaster, wouldn't it?
It would. So let me tell you a little history lesson here. Our region has a lot of history from the Civil War and the American Revolution. And during that time period, the soldiers from different areas of the country and other parts of the world, when they traveled to the Chesapeake Bay region, they came to realize that our Chesapeake Bay is extremely productive. Lots of fishes, lots of crabs, and lots of oysters. So especially after the Civil War, we had a lot of people move to this region and become fish farmers. They became fishermen. They were catching oysters, and in the process, they depleted the population. They took too many oysters out. But there's a second part to the story. When they caught the oysters and sold these animals, the oyster shells were treated like a candy wrapper, right? Right after Halloween, when we get our candy, we're just going to take that wrapper and throw it away. However, by taking these shells and not throwing them back into the Chesapeake Bay, instead throwing them away, we actually harmed the oyster population. Remember what I said about oysters being stuck together? They form these hills because babies need a place to live on. They need other oyster shells. So they don't care if the oyster shell is a living shell or not. They just want a surface to be stuck to. If instead of eating the oysters and throwing the shells on the ground as trash, if we collect the shells and ship them back to the Chesapeake Bay, then we create habitat for the baby oysters. So we harmed our population by overfishing it and by not throwing the shells back into the water. Consequently, from 1880 until today, the population of oysters declined 99%. We took out so many oysters that we harmed the filtration of our Chesapeake Bay. Today, the oyster population is very low compared to the year 1880. However, there's good news. There are oyster shell recycling programs going on, and those shells are being put back into the bay as habitat. So that's great news. The population's starting to come back.
That's fantastic. It's like everything under the water is all connected, and we took them away from that connection. And all we needed to do to keep them, or at least one big thing we needed to do to keep them all safe, is to put them back so they can be connected back to their environment.
Absolutely. So today we try to manage the fishery a little bit better. We let people catch oysters. However, not every place is a fishing location. The oysters have to be in the fishing location. There are protected areas, and we're encouraging the oystermen to collect the shells from the restaurants and putting them back into the oyster reef locations. So oysters are starting to come back, and consequently, in the past 5 years, we're seeing an increase in these underwater grasses. The water in the bay is becoming clearer, which creates more habitat for the grasses. They get more light, and with more light and more grasses, we get more aquatic life. So we're starting to see a change in our bay back to how it used to be a long time ago.
That is definitely some really good news. Well, thank you so much for talking to us about this, Andrew. That is really interesting, and I'm sure that all our viewers are going to be really excited to make sure that if they eat oysters, that the shells end up back where they belong.
That'd be great.
Before you go, do you have any more like interesting facts or a favorite fact about oysters that you'd like to share?
Sure, I'd like to teach you just a quick little life cycle of the oyster. So let me show you this diagram right here. And in this diagram, we've got two oysters, a female and a male oyster, so a girl and a boy. To reproduce, to have babies, all they do is open up their shells and throw their gametes, is what we call them, into the water, the egg and sperm. So they get fertilized up in the water column. The babies form little tiny swimming animals. We call them villager larvae. And as they swim around, they start to look for a place to live. Their favorite location is a hard surface, and especially an oyster shell is their favorite place. So they form a little tiny dot on top of that shell. We call that dot a spat. A baby oyster is known as a spat, and they grow on top of that shell, and after 2 or 3 years, they're ready to start to reproduce again. Now, it turns out that male oysters, the boys, actually change into female oysters later on in life. So what we call a sequential hermaphrodite. So we do want to change our drawing here eventually to make the male a little bit smaller and the female a little bit larger. You'll also notice on the drawing here something fascinating, these lines. Oysters grow their shells. The shells are actually their outside skeleton. And so scientists have a method of counting these lines to estimate the age of the oyster, just like we do with trees. If we look at the lines inside of a tree trunk, we can calculate how old the tree is, or if it's been chopped down, how old it was. In the case of an oyster, we can count the lines on the outside to figure out the age. Generally, with the eastern oyster, the one in the Chesapeake Bay, they generally grow about 1 inch every year. So oysters that are about 3 inches long are roughly 3 years old, and at that time, they've become a female oyster. So the oysters people harvest and eat are all girls.
Wow, that is so interesting. It's like the oysters are an underwater rainforest, so that kind of makes them like trees, and they have rings like trees too. That's just such a neat connection.
It is, absolutely. Now, as we've been talking, our oysters have just been sitting there. You might notice that these oysters have not opened up yet. They're very, very cautious. If a shadow comes over them, they think it's a fish or something else. And as I've been talking to you and showing you things, these oysters have seen lots of shadows. So during our presentation this morning, they have decided not to open up. But if they did open up, they only open up about 1 to 2 millimeters, just enough to allow water in, to filter the water and then blow the water out. So they'll open up when they're hungry enough and when they're not being disturbed.
Wow, so they're pretty shy.
Yep.
Wow. Well, that is so interesting, and I'm so glad we got this opportunity to see these really cool tanks and meet your oysters and your other fish friends. Before you go, is there anything else you'd like to share? I guess we're almost at our time now.
Absolutely. Well, AJ, I wanted to let you guys know that we are down near Washington, D.C. in Glen Echo, Maryland. It's basically where Bethesda, Maryland is. And we would love to have you visit, or if you'd like, we can arrange a Zoom presentation to your civic group or your school or your scouts. We love to share about the Chesapeake Bay and about all things in the water. So here at our aquarium, we focus just on our rivers and streams and Chesapeake Bay locally, but our presentations range all the way down to the deepest parts of the ocean. So if you're interested in visiting us, you can visit our website, gepaquarium.org, or you can give us a call at 571-334-8713, or here's our contact information.
Very cool. And we'll have all of that information down in the description of this video too. So if you would like to come and see Andrew or have him come and see you through Zoom, then you'll be able to click right down below this video. Well, thank you again for talking to me, Andrew.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for arranging this today. And I hope you guys have a wonderful experience and stay healthy, okay?
Yeah, you too. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.